Okay, good enough. Good. Okay, great. Okay, well, good. All right, welcome to class 19 using Brother Keogh's notes. In the last class, I talked about concepts. In the class before that, I talked about ultimate realities. In this class, we're going to talk about the transition between the two, moving from ultimate realities to concepts in daily life, and moving from concepts down to ultimate realities in meditation. Two directions, right? So let's start with daily life, where we start with the ultimate reality and then build up all the different layers of concepts until what we get is our perceived reality, what we think is real. Ultimate realities are the starting point for experiencing through the five senses: seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching. There's also ultimate realities related to the mind and the chitta and consciousness and chittasikas. But to make things a little simpler, I'm going to focus just on seeing. What happens during seeing? And the same kind of process, layered process, happens with hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, as well as the mental process as well. All right, so let's talk about seeing. First, the eye perceives a patch of color. This is from the suttas and from the Abhidhamma, but let's forward to what we understand today. How does the eye actually work? Well, there's a retina, and it's got all these nerve cells on it, some of them called rods, some of them called cones. Rods see bright light and dark. It's the black and white seeing. They're more sensitive. And the cones are the ones that see color. So that's why when it's quite dark out, you can't see any color. Everything looks black and white because it's just the rods giving you the vision. But when it's enough light out, you can see color. In the short wavelengths, not so many of them, those are the blues, the medium, which is the greens, then the yellows and reds. And on the eye, there's a lot of yellow and red, some green, and only a few blues. That's why it's very difficult for the human eye to differentiate different shades of blue, like yellows and reds that can differentiate quite easily. So this is kind of the chemistry of how it works. But the point here is that what the retina experiences is just a single dot of color coming in through the lens. It's just a dot of color. That's all that it is. That is appearing at the retina. And that little patch of color is visible form. That's an ultimate reality. Unless you are a meditator, you've probably never really been aware at that level of granularity of just seeing a small little patch of color, because the mind takes over and does all sorts of building on top of it. But this is how it's explained in the Abhidhamma, is that little patch of color, that little dot of color on the retina is the true ultimate reality. And everything else is built up from there. So we don't see a wall, or we don't see a computer. We see a little dot of color, like a pixel on a screen, right? We see one little dot, that's all, one pixel. But of course, in my field of view right now, there are many pixels, and I can see, put them together and see computer. Okay? So that's for seeing. For hearing, it's a small vibration. All right, so for each of the senses, there is this ultimate reality, which is quite fundamental compared to what we normally say we see or we hear or we smell or taste. So the ultimate reality in the case of the eye is the visible form, the dot of color. Next, it says in the suttas that the mind perceives a shape and then labels it. Now, when we talk about perceiving here, we're not talking about the Chaitasika Sanya. We're talking about a process of millions of chittas arising to glue together all those little dots. Remember that little pixel of color? The mind perceiving a shape. So the mind is now starting to work. These are now at a conceptual level. I'm now putting together the little dots, gluing them together into the whole view, the whole field of view, and going, oh, that's a square shape, and oh, I see keyboard, I recognize features, signs and features of what there is coming in on the eye, and then there is naming it, a label. This label is perceiving, it's perceived. It is the activity, perceiving, and giving a label is a mental function of memory, because I've seen a computer before, also naming. So let's imagine a scenario, walking down the street, and there are dots of color coming into the retina, and there is a shape. First, there's the lightness and darkness, then there's colors, then there's recognize the whole field of view, then there is the shape that goes, oh, flower. The mind goes, flower. Now, if I had been raised in the kampong, it might say bunga, right? Or a different language, right? But it doesn't change. This is what actually happens. The mind actually, it's all the mind's work right now, millions and millions of processes that glue together all these dots and recognize it, and then label, recognize it, label, naming, association. So, flower, bunga. Okay? Now, is this accurate? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. Ultimate realities have a essential characteristic. The essential characteristic, unique characteristic of a visible object is it's the sensitive part. It's when the sensitive part, when it hits the sensitive part of the eye, there's eye consciousness. That's the characteristic of a visible form. And it's always the same. However, different people can see different things. For example, different animals have different ways that their mind works, and they don't recognize shape or label. They don't have language or flower, but humans do. Right? And maybe when I'm walking down the street, the mind sees a certain shape and goes, oh, flower. But in reality, it's a silk artificial flower. So it's not really a flower, it's a piece of cloth that has been formed to create what appears to be a flower from a distance. So perception can be wrong. In fact, it often is. Don't believe that what you perceive is true. Once the mind has named something, the next step is it conceives. The Pali word for perception is sanya. The Pali word for conceiving is manyati, which means becoming one with oneself. What it involves is relating what has been seen to a self or an I, putting it into context. Now, I don't know about you, but whenever I have a dream, there's always me at the center of that dream. It's always about I. That's the way the mind works. It always organizes everything around this I, this concept of I. I talked about in the last class all the different parts of the brain and how they glue together to create this I. So this, once something is labeled and named, the mind naturally goes, oh, flowers. I like flowers, my wife likes flowers. I start to relate whatever that object that has been seen. Oh, computer, that's a nice computer. It's a modern, it's a new computer, right? I start to say, I would like to have that kind of computer, right? So I relate it to a self. Once it's related to a self, oh, things just go crazy. I start saying, I buy flowers for my wife. She will smile when I give them to her. I'm off in some fantasy world of buying flowers. Completely disconnected from the dark color that arrived at the eye, right? So this is how the mind goes from the particle color, which is the ultimate reality, and progresses through perceiving, conceiving, imagining, fantasizing. And this progression is happening all the time. Right? Now, I chose the colors especially because it's going to be repeated again and again. Green, blue, purple, and red. It forms a, so it's a very different perspective. The mind imagining, I will buy flowers with my wife, she'll smile when I give them to her. That is the daily life perspective. That's the mind is constantly telling a story. Emotions, stories, are all at this level. The visible form as an ultimate reality is a completely different perspective on what is being experienced. The ultimate realities, that's the world of the Vipassana yogi. Now, all the time, all right? I am a Vipassana yogi, but maybe only rare opportunities do I glimpse into this. Even a Buddha is aware of all of this, doesn't get caught up in the concepts, but their mind is continuing to work. And we'll talk about how the Buddha's mind works a little later. Right? The concepts are where we spend most of our time, constantly spinning around in all this imagination, the stories, the emotions. That's where the mind spends most of its time. And the way in which we can break this is by mindfulness. We can move up the chain through being mindful of what is happening. Moving up the chain through mindfulness. Now, let's go through, using that same color scheme, what we imagine to be real. Actually, what we imagine to be real is a kind of mixture of all these different aspects. It starts out with the ultimate reality at the core. Things that get triggered, like the little dot of color is the ultimate reality at the core. Wrapped around that ultimate reality, which exists independently of the mind, is a trigger for the mind to start perceiving or misperceiving, as the case may be. And it builds layer upon layer. Oh, the shape is understood and recognized, and then it's named, and the name is recognized and associated. Oh, that's the next layer. That perception, misperception, is what triggers the ego, what the conception of relating whatever is perceived to the self. That is the next layer that is built upon that, the perception, relating it to a self. And then, added by the imagination, is the final layer. It's the final layer. Actually, if this were to scale, 99.5% or more would be red, right? Because most of the time, the mind is not dealing with the dot, the ultimate reality, but building up, spending time recognizing or perceiving, conceiving, relating, and then lost in thought, imagining, and fantasizing. That's what most of the time is done. So linking that back to the earlier example, the ultimate reality is the patch of color. What is perceived or misperceived is the flower. It might be a real flower, but it might be just a piece of fabric. When it's conceived, oh, I like flowers. My wife likes flowers. That's when I start to relate that to myself, to a self. Adding in imagination. My wife smiled, more daydreams. Okay, that's what actually happens. Right? Planning and memories and planning and future and past. So this is how things get built up from the ultimate reality, how the mind works to create what is normally what we think is real, which is the outside circle, which is 99% red, our imagination, our emotions, our stories. And very rarely are we aware of these lower, more fundamental things. With mindfulness will, I'm talking about mindfulness in daily life, we can strip away and go, okay, I see what is happening here. Start being let's get caught up in the story. No, not in the future. I'm not in the past. I'm looking at this, the mind. This is the habit of the mind to conceive a self. And then, flower. This is what has been named. This is what has been identified before even there is the conception of I liking flowers and those flowers. I would say it's almost impossible in daily life to be aware of the patch of color or the small vibration of the ear. But in meditation, it can happen. And it is so bizarre when it happens because it is so out of the ordinary. Okay? So any questions on what I've covered so far? Yeah.
These are very because you use color. Say, one artist.
Okay. There's 5 sense organs, right? I've talked about the ultimate reality for the eye.
Yeah.
Visible object. That's what stimulates the eye is the eye sensitivity, which is the retina.
Okay.
Gets triggered by the ultimate reality, the patch of color, and starts off, and then that leads to eye consciousness. Those are all ultimate realities. Eye consciousness then starts all these other layers.
Besides color, is there any
Sure.
other ultimate
Vibration for sound.
sound? But say for eye,
No, for eye, only the eye is only sensitive to visible objects.
Everything is color.
Color. That's a small patch of color. That's all. Now, I put my finger on my arm, right? What is experienced here is a combination of temperature, pressure, and hardness. Those are the 3 ultimate realities experienced by the body. Temperature, pressure, and hardness. The sensitivity here, like when I'm sitting and there is pain. Pain is a concept. What is experienced is it's a hot thing. It is hot, or it is hard, or it is twisting and pulling. So it's always temperature, pressure, and hardness that are experienced by the body. So the hearing, what is experienced, it's not a sound it's not a bird that you hear. A bird is at this level. What's heard here is a vibration. Give you an example. One day I was meditating, and my meditation was very deep. There was awareness. There was like a screen in front of me, and there was awareness. Oh, there's a sound. All I knew is that there is a sound. Is it a high sound or a low sound? Don't know. Didn't do this. Didn't do any naming. Is it a bird or is it a cricket? Don't know. All there was awareness of, there is a sound at the ear. That's all there was. Didn't get caught up in whether it was to the right, to the left, whether it was a bird, whether it was a cricket, whether it was loud or soft. The mind didn't differentiate. All it knew, all the mind was just aware of is vibration. There's a sound up there. And I couldn't tell you whether it was a high sound or a low sound. Could have been anything. Okay? That's when the mindfulness was very deep, concentration was good, we were at the ultimate reality level. Another example that I gave in the last class, I was doing walking meditation and watching the mind fetch little pieces of color. And there was awareness that, oh, it's patching all these different patches together, and that's a person. Oh, that's Lily Kim, another yogi. I like Lily Kim. He's a nice guy. Right? I'm starting to relate Lily Kim to me, right? And then I started thinking about other experiences with Lily Kim in the past and planning in the future. But it started out with patches of color. So when the meditation, when there is very good continuous mindfulness leading to concentration, good concentration, then there can be awareness. Not normal in daily life. It's a bizarre, different experience than what we have experienced through our normal existence. So we talked about sight, we talked about hearing, we talked about touch, smell, and taste also have ultimate realities. Okay, I have never experienced smell and taste as ultimate realities personally, but the Abhidhamma says that there are ultimate realities of smell and taste. There are also ultimate realities of the mind. I'm not going into them here because it is so easy to slip from being aware of consciousness into a concept of consciousness because they're all inside the mind. It's so easy to slip. Okay. So, any other questions on this stuff? Yeah.
This thing, I don't know whether
Yeah, brother.
Process of thinking. Because you see, me as a normal human being, you can't stop. Okay, that what I'm seeing is a flower. You can't stop that, right? Maybe our memory has really built up, or I like flowers, that kind of stuff. So the way that I look at it, we can't stop, right? It will automatically just continue to think.
Okay. Now, I understand exactly what you're saying. I remember a time when I was meditating and there was awareness of things arising and disappearing a million times a second. Okay? I reported it to my teacher. I said, I saw things arising and falling away a million times a second. I said, I didn't think the mind could work that fast. The teacher said, you're right. The mind cannot think that fast. The mind cannot think millions of times a second. However, Panya, direct understanding, can arise with every chitta. It can experience things millions of times a second. The mind cannot think so fast. Thinking, this is a very primitive form of thinking. Moonlight flower. This is a more coarse form of thinking. The conceiving, saying, I like flowers, that's a more coarse form of thinking. And this is the most coarse type of thinking there is. Fantasies about buying flowers for my wife and my wife being happy about it. With mindfulness, normal day-to-day mindfulness, you can strip away the red, you can strip away the imagination. With normal mindfulness, you can strip away the ego. But it takes, to get down to this level, one needs to the blue perception level, one needs more than just mindfulness. One needs Panya, direct experience. And it is so bizarre to have experienced this, that things happening a million times a second. You know they're happening millions of times a second, but the mind can't think that fast. So the speed of thinking is in the red and the purple. The speed of direct experience is at the blue and the green. Right? Any other questions on this stuff?
Brother Rob,
Okay.
Brother Christy. So there are two aspects to
So
the
there are colors: green for the ultimate reality, blue for what is perceived or misperceived, purple or pink for what is conceived, and red is added by the imagination. That's the layers, how things go, right? I'm going to go through a sutta, the Mulapraya Sutta, which is the root of existence, sutta. It's the first sutta in the Majjhima Nikaya. Okay. The Buddha is in this sutta explaining to 500 monks how the mind works for different types of people. The Buddha started by saying, untaught, ordinary person, that's us. Okay? It doesn't matter how much we've learned, we haven't yet experienced Nibbana. So we are considered a worldling, or the direct translation from the Pali is an untaught, ordinary person, misperceive or perceives the seen as the seen. That's perception. Having perceived the seen as the seen, he conceives himself as the seen. He conceives himself in the seen. He conceives himself apart from the seen. He conceives the seen to be mine. In other words, relates whatever is seen to a self. That's what the Buddha is saying. Then he delights in the seen, which is the imagination, delighting in it. And the Buddha said, why is that? Because he's not understood. He is not at the stage where he's not experienced Nibbana. The mind is not yet cultivated to the point where they truly understand. So, on this chart, this sutta does not talk directly about ultimate realities. Next sutta will talk about ultimate realities. But for the ordinary person, they misperceive, and because of that, they conceive and they delight. That's their habit. They go through their whole life. Most people go through their whole lives, 100% of the time, doing this. The next part of the sutta said, a trainee bhikkhu. What is a trainee bhikkhu? The Pali word is sekha, and it means someone who has already become a sotapanna. Sotapanna, Sakadagami, Anagami, the first three stages of sainthood. So this person who has already uprooted the self-view, uprooted attachment to rites and rituals, uprooted any skeptical doubt, how does their mind work? The Sotapanna, Sakadagami, Anagami, how does their mind work? The trainee bhikkhu directly knows the seen as the seen. No more wrong view. Sees the seen as the seen. Having directly known the seen as the seen, he should not conceive himself as the seen, not conceive himself in the seen, not conceive himself apart from the seen, not conceive the seen to be mine. Well, I thought he got rid of self. How can he conceive? Conceive is asmamani. It is the conceit of I. The Sakaya Diti, which is uprooted by the Sotapanna, is the belief that these five aggregates are a self. There's some relationship between the self and the five aggregates. That's Sakaya Diti. But the Sotapanna, though they've given up that thinking or that perspective or that thinking of the five aggregates as being the self, they haven't given up conceit. They still say, oh, I am different from him. I am better. I am worse. I'm saying there still is this conceit of a perspective of I that is behind their thinking. It's very deep. That type of conceiving is only given up by the Arahant. So even though most of the time they've given up, there's still the potential of conceiving. So the Buddha is saying for those people who are already trainees, already the trainee, already at Sotapanna stage, far ahead of us, they are not going to, they'll directly know rather than misperceive. And they should be working on developing themselves to get rid of conceit and get rid of conceiving. And as they get rid of conceiving, they get rid of delight. But there still is that craving, that little bit of craving for existence in that trainee. Even though they're Sotapanna and Skaragami, Anagami, they still have that craving for existence. They still have that craving for sense objects in the Sotapanna Skaragami. So there still is some craving behind that continues. They still delight in sense objects or still delight in existence. How about the Arahant? Arahant also directly knows the seen as the seen. They do not conceive any of those ways. They have completely gotten rid of conceit. They don't conceive. And therefore they don't delight. Why? Because they have fully understood whatever is seen. No attachment, no aversion, no delusion. They have fully understood. So this is only at the stage of Arahant that one gets to the directly knowing, not conceiving, not delighting. And this is very interesting. Then the Buddha talked about not just the Arahant, but the Tathagata, the Buddha himself. It's the exact same wording. They directly know, just like the Arahant, right? The Buddha is an Arahant. The Buddha directly knows, does not conceive, does not delight. Why? Because he has fully understood to the end. What is the difference between the Arahant and the Buddha? The Arahant was because he's fully understood. The Buddha has fully understood it to the end. Now, what is the difference between an Arahant and a Buddha? The Arahants and the Buddhas have all given up attachment, aversion, delusion. They've uprooted all of those things. However, the Arahant's understanding is only limited to their own experience. The Buddha's understanding is universal. I'll give you an example of this from the commentary. There was Sariputta, the number 2 disciple, who's teaching a monk how to meditate and not making much progress. So Sariputta brought this monk to the Buddha. Okay? And the Buddha said, aha, this particular monk, for 500 previous existences, was a goldsmith. He loves gold. You've given him the wrong meditation object. So the Buddha gave him a golden lotus as his meditation object, and then the Buddha then made that golden lotus disappear. Golden lotus disappearing was enough to have that monk recognize the impermanence. So the difference between Sariputta, the Arahant, who, number 2, just behind the Buddha, in wisdom and everything, he didn't have the total understanding of how to help this particular monk. Whereas the Buddha could see this particular monk, could fully understand this particular monk, and understand how to guide them. So, what about a Pacceka Buddha? A Pacceka Buddha, they are an Arahant because they're fully enlightened, right? They are self-enlightened, they got there by themselves, but they cannot teach. They do not teach. So they're not a Samasan Buddha. They haven't understood to the end. And so in this particular sutta, the Buddha Sutta, the Buddha was giving a very detailed explanation of how ordinary people think, how trainee monks think, how arhats think, and how he thinks, contrasting them this way. And this is one of, I think, the only sutta that I'm aware of where at the end it says the 500 monks did not approve. They didn't like what they'd heard. They were upset. Normally at the end of a sutta, all the monks would say, that's fantastic, that's great. In this particular case, it was the opposite. And the reason is that these 500 monks had just joined. They used to be Brahmins and were very proud of their ability to understand all this intellectual stuff. And they recently joined the Buddha, become disciples of the Buddha, and they were so proud that they memorized all these teachings from the Buddha, but they weren't practicing. They weren't meditating. And so the Buddha said, I got to teach these guys a lesson. So he gave this sutta, and when some of them said, I don't understand what he's talking about, which was enough to shake their ego. Others understood what he was talking about and said, he's attacking me. All right, thought the Buddha was attacking them. Why would they get so upset about this? It's because of conceiving. In the Brahmins, it is built into the Brahmin philosophy of this Atman, the self, the soul. And so when the Buddha said that, hey, don't conceive, this was a direct attack on their way of thinking that they've been trained up on. Okay. So that's why they got upset. Good news is later they heard another sutta from them. They went and started practicing more, and the 500 monks got enlightened in a later sutta. So this is a very, and by the way, I've only talked about the scene. When you read the sutta, it goes through 24 different things, 24 different objects, but using the exact same pattern. I'm just using the scene as one example because we talked about it in the last class, in this class, about visible objects. Any questions on the Mullapraya Sutta? This is a tough sutta to understand. Any questions on this? Okay, now let's go to another sutta, the Madhupindika Sutta, the Honeyball Sutta. Madhupindika means honeyball. I think in Malay they also say madhu for honey, right? Pindika is basically when monks eat, they're supposed to roll their food into a little ball before they eat it. And that little ball that they eat is called the Pindika. So this is the Honeyball Sutta. And the background of this sutta is that the Buddha was explaining to a wandering ascetic, why is it that people argue and fight with each other? How come there's conflict in the world? And so the Buddha tried to explain to this person it's because of mental proliferation. He didn't understand. Mahakachana came and explained, dependent on the I invisible form, I consciousness arises. The meeting of the three is contact. With contact as a condition, there is feeling. What one feels, one perceives, or labels in the mind. What one perceives, one thinks about. What one thinks about, one proliferates. So let's put this as a chart. I, invisible form, create consciousness. Together they create contact. The definition of the three together is contact. And when there is contact, there is feeling. Those are all ultimate realities. That's why they're in green. So if we look, and then we get perception, which is perceiving, labeling in the mind, which is blue, thinking about, which is purple, proliferating, which is red. Now, the top group eye arises naturally, the physical eye. Visible form, the dots of color, they arise naturally. Eye consciousness arises naturally. Whenever there is a retina receiving a dot of color, there is eye consciousness at the retina. Those are ultimate realities that arise. Within that same citta, there is contact and feeling. So the stuff above the red line, that's a natural event that happens automatically. For an uninstructed worldling, for a Buddha and everybody in between, all this happens naturally. Buddhists see the same mechanical way that we do. Eye consciousness, sorry, eye sensitivity, visible form, eye consciousness, contact and feeling arising in one instant. Here is so this is an objective. This is objective. Perception is, and thinking and proliferation is a subjective series of processes that depend on one's condition. And that's where things are different for a Buddha and us. For us, the way in which we perceive, the way in which we conceive, the way in which we think and proliferate is all driven by our habits, our accumulations, our tendencies. That's what drives all this. All of our attachment, aversion, delusion, all that comes in here. Whereas a Buddha or an Arahat, their perception, they directly know. Remember, they don't, for the previous sutta, they don't just perceive, they directly know. And because they directly know, the way in which they think is not distorted. The way in which, and therefore they don't proliferate. They understand clearly, not spinning out of control. Proliferation. Now, there's different places that distortions can arise. We'll start with the distortion of perception. I'll give you a story from the old commentary. Imagine a person walking down the path, a dark path at night. Very little moon, very little light. In reality, there is a coil of rope on the side of the path. This person, from the side of their eye, they see this coil of rope and they perceive a snake. Immediately, they perceive a snake. Once there is the perception of a snake. Now, first of all, people are naturally afraid of snakes. I remember reading an article where they took monkeys who had been raised in captivity, and these monkeys had been raised in captivity, had never seen a snake before. Okay? And when they showed these monkeys a snake, the monkeys were terrified. So there is something within the brain, I don't know why, that makes snakes scary. They're inherently scary. So walking down the road, down the path at night, no light, there's a coil of rope, the mind, because of that fear of snakes, perceives a snake. That perception of having thought, perceiving a snake, together with the fear of snakes, it comes together and starts distortion of thought, thinking about snakes. Then, once start thinking about snakes, there's a distortion of view. There is a belief that's a snake. And the mind naturally reacts with emotion, jumps back out of fear. There's a fear arising. And that fear actually reinforces the latent fear of snakes. So it becomes self-fulfilling. That fear of snakes becomes deeper and deeper and deeper because of the distortion of perception, twisting what was the coil of rope into a thought of the perception of a snake, start thinking about snakes, the belief that it's a snake, and the mind starts going crazy and jumping back with fear, and that fear reinforces the state belief. Basically, we don't see things as they are, we see things as we are. 99% of what we perceive, what we see, is our own, as a reflection of our own habits and beliefs. Okay? Now, I'm going to, a little bit quickly, go through going the other direction, going from concepts. So far I've built up from ultimate realities into concepts. Now we're going to go the other direction. This is the meditator's point of view. Breaking concepts into individual ultimate realities, seeing concepts and having all the different components, seeing the individual pixels. When you go to the meditation retreat, the teacher will tell you to note the rising and falling of the abdomen, the up and down, the movement in the abdomen. Okay? And so that is a concept. Rising and falling is a concept. Abdomen is a concept. But one starts one's meditation with concepts, because before going on retreat, your mind was completely wrapped up in concepts. It takes a few days, if you're lucky, for this to settle down. I haven't been on retreat for more than a year now, and in a couple of days I'm going away. Oh, I'm looking forward to it. I'll be gone for 2 months. Be back in mid-January. Oh. But I know for the first probably a week, the mind is still going to be wrapped up in rising, falling, expanding, contracting, all this concepts. However, these concepts are like a picture frame that bring one's attention, focus one's attention to the underlying ultimate reality, pointing to the ultimate reality. So after a while, continuous mindfulness, that rising, falling, with continuous mindfulness, one experiences, the yogi experiences the ultimate reality, the specific characteristics of the ultimate reality. So it's just pushing. It's like a push. So no more rising, falling. Now it's just an experience of push. Because the air element, which is the ultimate reality, one of the things that physically one feels. Remember when I physically put my finger on my arm, there was pressure, there was temperature, there was hardness. With rising, falling, normally it's the air element or the pushing, the pressure that one experiences. So pushing. With more continuous mindfulness, then the pushing becomes irrelevant. It's just disappearing, dissolving constantly. Whether it's pushing or anything else, just dissolving. And that is the general characteristic of the ultimate reality, starting with anicca. And this all happens when the mind is ready. All these new perceptions, these subtle new perceptions of object present themselves. You don't have to say, okay, I'll finish the concepts and I'll now start working with ultimate realities, the specific characteristics. No, just keep mindfulness continuous. Mindfulness being continuous, concentration will increase naturally, and that will naturally lead to a direct experience of specific characteristics. Keep going, and that will naturally lead to the general characteristics of anicca. Now, at this stage, you can tell when you're by the language that the yogi uses. If they're still stuck at this stage, they're still at this stage. So I don't say stuck, but when they're at this stage, they say things like, my leg is painful. I've been with yogis in joint retreat, in joint interviews, and I hear the other yogi talking about, oh, my leg is painful. And to me, that's okay, yep, they're still at the label, the concept stage, right? because they're always using the word I, my, I, me, mine. Those words are all the time being used during the interview. That's fine. Everyone needs to start. Okay? The teacher is trying to guide them to be less attached to these concepts. Instead of saying leg is painful, to the next stage, the yogi will say there's pressure. Instead of they're talking about pain, they talk about, oh, there's this pulling, this twisting, there's this sharpness, there's a hardness in front of me. Doesn't have a location. It's right in front of the mind. When they start talking about those interdependent mental and physical activities, things like pressure, temperature, hardness existing, not associating it with a leg or not associating it with me, then you know that they're at this stage. They're at the middle stage of recognizing the specific characteristics. They can describe the pushing, different ways of this thing turning and pulling, or it's so hard, so I'm hitting against. So this is the kind of language. There's no I, there's no self. Pain exists, or rather pressure, temperature, and hardness exists. Then the last stage, the language they use is, it's like everything's just disappearing, constantly disappearing, millions of times a second, things are disappearing. It's like being hit with a machine gun. It was just being shot by a machine gun. Things are changing constantly. If they don't even talk about pressure, temperature, hardness, things are changing all the time. Things are dissolving, constantly dissolving. It's like one of those wall calendars, pages are being ripped off. There's other paper coming in behind it. So many different ways of describing it, always in analogies. They always describe this in analogies because their experience is not something that the concepts of words are used to describing. So here I have kind of quickly gone over moving from concepts to ultimate realities from the Vipassana yogi's perspective. All right, so we first went through ultimate realities being built up in layers that form concepts in the mind that think it's real. And now we're going the opposite direction, starting out with concepts and moving to the ultimate realities, but then past the ultimate realities to the characteristic of the ultimate realities. Okay. Now, for some people who practice Kaya Vipassana, they focus on physical sensations. And they talk about pressure, temperature, or hardness. And then move to everything is disappearing. Some people practice Abhidhamma Vipassana. The experience, the feeling tone existing. And then everything disappearing. Chitta Vipassana, the mind. Describing the mind as a contracted mind or a greedy mind or a detached mind, and then everything disappearing. Dhammanupassana, describing individual chittasikas. Oh, this is a lot of fun. Chittasikas, describing their individual characteristics. Oh, I see how volition is working in the mind. Oh, I see how concentration is happening in the mind, what it's doing to all the other chittasikas. But then eventually it comes to just everything's disappearing. So it doesn't matter where you start. Kaya Vipassana, Abhidhamma Vipassana, Chitta Vipassana, Dhamma Vipassana, you always end up with everything's disappearing. And that everything disappearing, which is anicca, triggers the experience of dukkha. There's nothing firm, there's nothing solid, there's no footing. Everything is just, there's nothing there. All the five aggregates, you don't think it's five aggregates, but whatever is experienced just is dissolving. There's nothing to hold on to. That is unsatisfactoriness, oppression, suffering. That is together with anicca. And then anatta, where, hey, nothing I can do about it. It's just how it happens. There's no self behind any of this. And I'm helpless. Just a self. That is anatta. So anicca, dukkha, anatta are three different perspectives on the same experience. Continuous disappearing comes first, then the suffering aspect, the oppression aspect of dukkha, and then finally the nothing I can do about it aspect of anatta. Any questions on this stuff? Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
When you mean like state, there's nothing, the three characters state. Then what will happen now? You have wisdom.
Okay.
You realize all these things.
All right. That, to answer that, we go back to the previous sutta where we talked about the way of thinking of a ordinary person. Now, an ordinary person who hasn't experienced any of this, like most of us, they just keep going and delighting in things because they start perceiving and conceiving and delighting. That's how they think. Now, the trainee, the sekha, who has gone through all of this, experienced nibbana, become a sotapanna, they're a saint, they're already a trainee. They also experience all of this. There was a sutta in which Sariputta was asked by a monk, how does an uninstructed worldling practice? And Sariputta laid all this out. Okay? See discern the constant dissolving of everything. Okay? Then the monk said, okay, how about a sotapanna? How do they practice? Sariputta repeated himself. See, discerning the constant dissolving of everything. How about a Sakanagami? How does the Sakanagami practice? Discerning this. Anagami, Arahat. Even an Arahat. How does an Arahat practice? Exactly the same. So the difference is that how it impacts how they think. Now, okay, let's say experience this three characteristics. That is the third insight knowledge. Number 3, you gotta get up to 16 before you're sotapanna. You hit 3. In other classes, I've talked about the 4th and 5th and 6th, they become much more complicated, or it's I talked about those. I'm just bringing out the third characteristic. For someone who's experienced this, it's like opening the window a little bit, but the mind has still got so many habits, so many accumulations and ways of thinking that are make it the uninstructed worldling. They're not uprooted yet. One has to not just become when one becomes a sotapanna. Yes, some of those ways of thinking, that first experience of nibbana, of a sotapanna, they realize that there is no sakaya ditti, no personality belief. They still have conceit. Don't have any belief in a self. They know that there's no rites and rituals to get to the end. It's through practice. That's how you get there, not through rites and rituals, through direct experience. And there's no skeptical doubt, because through their direct experience, they've experienced nibbana. Great. But they still have defilements. They still have attachment, aversion, wrong view. That's right, delusion. They don't have wrong view, they have delusion. So, if you were to meet a sotapanna on the street, tough to tell. Very tough to tell, because they still have so many of those characteristics. But at least having glimpsed into this, the third instant knowledge, one starts to recognize that, hey, I'm on a path. This is the right path. I want to keep doing this. So I believe that when someone has reached the third insight knowledge, they're just they gotta move forward. They have to keep practicing. They want to keep practicing because they know that that's the path. Okay, so anyway, in 2 months' time, I'll come back. And if I look any different, then you'll know.
We don't have the opportunity to experience that.
Right.
At least we have opportunity to have a flavor of it. We don't taste it, but we can smell it.
I'm trying to give you some of my experiences.
Yeah.
I'm trying to give you some of my experiences.
But we have the smell and
Yeah.
and the feeling of the taste.
So, but at least you've got a little conceptual layout, and the key, and I want to stress this, is it's continuous mindfulness. That's the thing that keeps you moving along the path, is continuous mindfulness. And that's where I talk about things happening so fast, millions of times a second, because of continuous mindfulness. Yeah.
One question, Rob, I think for beginners, that's why we not really have a lot of this meditation experience. So I know at least depend on the person. I think in general, from one stage to the next stage, right? Now the minimum times or years or months, right? You need is it from one stage to the next stage.
Okay. I can guarantee you
Okay.
that when I go to practice,
Yeah.
I'm gonna start here. I'm gonna start at the concept level, watching rising falling, because the mind is just so accumulated to that. However, because of my past practice.
Yeah.
For me, probably about 3 or 4 days before I get to this stage. Okay, 3 or 4 days till you get to that stage. But that's because of my past practice, my quote paramis, my potential. Another person, maybe they've got far better potential than I have because of past life even. The first time they sit down, maybe they can keep this. Not very often, but it can happen. So it depends on your paramis, your potential from past experience, whether it's past experience in this life or future lives. And I can tell you personally, minimum 3 days, because I gotta clean up the garbage. I mean, there's just so much garbage collected in this mind over the last so however long. I gotta get a chance to just flush out, clean it out, and then through continuous mindfulness, the specific characteristics of ultimate realities, they'll happen naturally. And that's why when you go on retreat, the teacher won't even hold any interviews for the first 3 or 4 days. He said, why bother? All I'm gonna hear about is rising, falling. Why bother? All right, they don't even start. Yeah, I mean, the most experienced yogis, even for the first few days, are gonna be rising, falling. Can you imagine that poor teacher having to listen to, oh yeah, okay, again. But that, so they delay the first interview for a few days, because you got no time to warm up. Actually, I'm going on retreat in a couple of days, 3 or 4 days before the formal retreat starts, just to rev up the engine, start it going. Because I know that we'll be here, which is fine. I have no problem being here. Because if you start to have aversion, you start blaming yourself, having problems with this, that's even more problems. Just, okay, that's what the mind is doing right now. It just needs some time. The mind is tired. The mind is restless. The mind is planning. The mind is remembering. That's what the mind is doing. Let time for the garbage to flow out. And don't use your hand phone. Every time you look at your hand phone, things get reset. Things get reset. And don't talk to people. Because you'll just reset the whole thing. You're wasting your time.
But you know, like say, of course, from stage 1 to stage 2 in banks or in armies.
Yeah.
Will there be people that it will never happen from stage 1 to stage 2? Or is it the time? Of course, you put the more time beside your whatever you have. The time that you put, the more retreat, the longer retreat, and everything.
Okay, I'll say the longer
it will never happen. Some people.
there are some people who, well, first of all, if you only go for like 3-day retreats, never gonna get very far. Never.
Never.
If you only do day retreats at home or meditate a little bit at home, you're not gonna progress this very far. And there are some people whose minds just are not, but those people wouldn't go on retreat anyway. There are some people who are spiritually oriented, some people who are not spiritually oriented. In the Abhidhamma context, we say that the Valangachita has got the wisdom root. Those people without a wisdom root in their Valangachita, in their life continuum, no Valangachita, they are never going to be able to attain jhana, they're never going to be able to attain sainthood, but they don't care, right? Because they don't have the wisdom built in. All of you, guaranteed, have got wisdom because you dedicated your time, made an effort to come here, and that shows me that your life continuum, your basic fabric, has got a wisdom component. It needs to get, there's this craving, this urging to, I need to get this satisfied. So that's why I'm coming here to better understand. So, for anybody who would attend this class, I'm sure that they have that given enough time. Maybe 3 days wouldn't be enough for you if it's your first retreat. That's why retreats are typically minimum 10 days. 3 days to get rid of the garbage, and then at the end, the last 3 days, the mind is starting to become more worldly again. You need at least 3 or 4 days in the middle to have some good experiences. Yeah, so don't go for 10 days, don't go for a 3-day retreat. It's not going to be so useful. Go for at least 10 days. And there are many teachers who won't accept people coming in for less than 10 days. They say, look, you're wasting your time, you're wasting my time. Okay, any other questions? Okay, Chris, any questions from you? You lose Chris? Okay, so I'll see you end of January. Yes, 2 months. And if I come back with a halo. Yeah, no. Okay, somebody could read the reflections.
Let us recall to our mind this morning, we come to the temple with the soul first to study the Dharma. With good faith, sadhana, and wise attention, sati, we learn and understand some of the Lord Buddha's teaching. Whenever there is any doubt or wrong understanding of teaching, we seek to clear our doubts and straighten our views. With a proper understanding of the Dharma, we can now put it into practice. The right understanding of the Dharma will produce right thoughts that in turn give rise to right action, right speech, and right livelihood. With such a right frame of mind can face the reality of life. May the merits punya begin through listening to the Dharma, discussing what the Dharma and strengthening our views, help us in overcoming conflicts we may face. In all things inhabiting space and earth, there are matters of mighty powers rejoice in these merits we have acquired, and we may long protect and bless us. With this merit being a contributing cause for the realization of mind. Abhidhamma Iva Nasa Pachat Yohotu.
Sa.
The sacred service to our teachers. Sa.
Um,